Build creative confidence. Beat the inspiration addiction. Join the Writer's Gym. Dr Caroline Sharples is a historian of modern Germany with long-standing research interest in memories of National Socialism and representations of the Holocaust. She has held the post of senior lecturer in history at the University of Roehampton since 2017 and is the author of West Germans and the Nazi Legacy, Routledge 2012, and Postwar Germany and the Holocaust, Bloomsbury 2016. She's co-editor, alongside Olaf Jensen, of Britain and the Holocaust, Remembering and Representing War and Genocide, Palgrave Macmillan 2013. She has a particular fascination in the post-execution fate of Holocaust perpetrators, writing several essays on Allied policy making regarding the Nazi corpse and perpetrator burials, commemoration and exhumation. It is against this backdrop that she turned her attention to the much-mythologized fate of Adolf Hitler himself, seeking to explore just why the demise of the Nazi dictator has fascinated public audiences for so many decades. The resulting book, The Long Death of Adolf Hitler, An Investigative History, constitutes the first cultural history approach in this topic. Caroline is passionate about public engagement and finding new ways to talk about her research. She has penned blogs for History Matters, a site run by the University of Sheffield to explore the historical context behind contemporary news headlines or significant anniversaries, and magazine articles for History Today and Aspects of History. Most recently, she was commissioned to write features for both the Big Issue and the Daily Telegraph in connection with her Long Death of Adolf Hitler book, and has featured on several leading podcasts, including BBC History Extra and the New Books Network. Caroline, it's been quite the year for that book to come out, hasn't it?
It has. It's been absolutely crazy. It only came out in March, and it feels like it's been a whirlwind of activity ever since.
Absolutely. And I came to your launch at the Barnes Bookshop near Roehampton.
That was quite fun, actually, wasn't it? Getting people in a bookshop. Everybody stopped standing around slightly awkwardly at first because wine and bookshops doesn't quite seem to be appropriate. But everybody then relaxed and got into it, so it was nice.
It's funny that, because I would have to say wine and bookshops are two of my favourite things, but there is always something quite surreal about putting one of them in the other. So tell me about you and how you came to writing. Has writing always been a part of life?
Do you know, I think it has, actually. And I was thinking this morning, that I don't often sort of sit down and have the chance to actually reflect on me as a writer and the process. But you've actually kind of hit the nail on the head, because when I was really, really little, my mum will tell you that I would devour books. And obviously, before I could read, she would read them to me, and then she'd catch me later kind of pretending to read it back to myself because I'd remember key phrases. And my uncle has, this is hilarious, basically a torn out bit of a notepad with like babyish writing when I was about 4 or 5, and tried to write my first story, as it were. And it was obviously really basic, so-and-so and her friend moved house, but he's kept it all these years, complete with, ridiculously childlike drawings and stuff. So he's always threatening to bring it out at formal professional occasions as evidence of my first work. For many years, people said, what do you want to be when you grow up? I thought, oh yeah, I want to be a writer. And I wasn't quite sure what that meant, but, I loved reading, and I'd always be reading, and got through all of the library stuff, and was trying to get into sort of the section for adults way before I was 14 or so, because I've read it all, move on. So that was always my thing. And I did English literature at A-level, and I was getting to the point where if I was going to apply to university, I was always thinking, well, it's probably going to be English in some way. And by this point, I was thinking, maybe I want to go into journalism, writing, that sort of way. And then I just sort of fell in love with history. I was already doing that for A-level. I was finding I loved the challenge of actually working with different types of sources. And it was literally as I was reading a university prospectus, and I just changed my mind, thinking, no, actually, I've done English for quite a while. I want to try history. I want a bit more challenge. And obviously writing is a huge part of that as well. Still doing all the readings, doing research and writing. But I don't think it was really until this most recent book, The Long Death of Adolf Hitler, that I think I actually feel like, yeah, actually, I am a writer. I'm not just the academic or the lecturer or the historian, but I'm actually doing something here in how I'm framing this story. And I just think I'm growing in confidence and actually using that writer label for myself.
It's so lovely to hear that. One of our recent guests, Kim Morgan, who founded Barefoot Coaching, where I trained, and has a column in Psychology's magazine, going back years and wrote two of my favourite books on coaching, so on one of the most important subjects to me. When I first emailed her, was at pains to explain to me it was lovely to hear from me, but she wasn't really a writer. Other people were writers. And we had that conversation. She now owns it, the term writer as well. But you're picking up on something that I do think is so common and fascinating, is we do spend quite a lot of time waiting to feel like a writer and not equating that to doing the writing. That if you were running, you're currently running. If you're writing, you're currently writing. But there is something we put on a pedestal around it, isn't there?
Yeah, I think so. And I think, having, written those previous books, as you mentioned at the start, they still feel very formal in the way that they're presented. So the first book, West Germans and the Nazi Legacy, that's essentially the text from my PhD thesis. And obviously a PhD thesis, you're writing to get through a particular exam, aren't you? And you've got to hit certain notes and it has to be structured in a way. So when I turn that into a book, at the time, I don't think I spent as long as I perhaps should have done thinking about that transition to something a bit more public facing. I mean, it's with Routledge, and it's a hugely expensive book, and probably nobody's ever really read it as a result. I added extra chapters for context, but I didn't necessarily fundamentally change the way I was approaching it. Whereas with this new book, it's definitely been thinking a bit more about, well, what's the actual story here, and how can I tell this in a way? So I guess it's kind of like, you learn the rules of what you need to do for your discipline. And once you've got that, you think, well, okay, now how do I shake this up a little bit?
And that for me is very important, the confidence of that I've shown myself I can do this. And somehow that can be where we get our permission for what do I want to do? And I don't know if you hear this from your students, but I have a lot of people thinking academia means you have to use very long, convoluted sentences, whereas actually quite often what you're talking about, has anyone read it, is about the journey towards finding more audience, being more accessible, perhaps.
Yes, absolutely. I say this to my students sometimes. Yeah, okay, that's a nice flowery phrase, but what do you actually mean by that? What's the point? I think you can say that faster.
Yeah, it's getting rid of the oyster and finding the pearl, isn't it?
Yes.
You said something I found very interesting about the relationship between doing literature and moving to history. That it was almost like, well, I think you said I've done that. What changed, or what did you notice? What made you move?
I think by the time I did A-level English literature, I still loved it, but I think maybe I was starting to fall out of love with it a little bit. I think it was a bit too much sitting around and really kind of doing the nitty-gritty analysing, or what's the intended metaphor here, which is very important, obviously, but I think it took some of the soul out of it, I think, for me a little bit. Whereas history was not necessarily my strongest subject, but I think that's that really kind of ignited the passion. It's like, well, I think writing at that point, it still felt, I've been doing this for a while, whatever silly little form, but I've always been writing and reading, and maybe history is pushing me in a slightly different direction. And that's why I decided to do that as the degree.
And there's maybe a parallel there between what you were saying to your students about, yes, but now say something. What do you want to say? And what do you want to do? Maybe history was more about doing something than...
Yeah, I think so. And then I think I sort of found that I was better at writing something where I knew I could hide behind other sources, so I'm not a creative writer. Everything is evidenced along the way. So I think that might be, that came more easily to me. And maybe that's a confidence thing as well.
I mean, I'm going to say, yeah, hell yeah, it is. Because when you're talking about the new book and seeing your voice in there, and you've mentioned weaving yourself into it, that you need to be there in order for this to be structured around what's important to you, what makes it your book. For me, it's kind of a misreading of creative, that we have our memories, we have our imagination, we have our questions and observations about the world. We mix those paints just as a painter would, and only you have your history. Literally, only you have ever lived the life you've lived, so only you have those colours and therefore those combinations. I do wonder actually if that is quite a widespread thing in academia, that I do hear a lot. I'm not a creative writer. Does that feel familiar?
I think so. And I like the way you've just described it. And I think that actually is a really helpful way. And I'm going to remember that. I'm mixing my paints. I suppose the real transformative moment for me was a couple of years ago, 2 or 3 years ago now. I did a continuing professional development course run out of Manchester Metropolitan University, and it's headed by the amazing Catherine Fletcher, who is just phenomenal in terms of public history. And it was all about how do you take your research public. We had workshops, a lot of it mainly online, but you learn, about using social media or various different ways of articulating public history. But there was a session when we were talking about writing and doing something that was a bit more, as they called it, trade press rather than academic press. And we were given these little exercises, 20 minutes, come up with something. There was somebody else on the course who was doing early modern history. And she just volunteered to read this thing that she'd penned in 20 minutes. And it was the most amazing sort of paragraph, immediately gripping. It read like a historical novel. It had the weather, the sort of real kind of tension building up as this woman was trying to sneak out of a castle to saddle a horse and carry these secret letters to England at the height of, the sort of various Tudor conflicts that were going on. It was brilliant. And then one of the questions somebody said was, okay, so how much is that? Did you imagine how much is that the evidence? And she was, oh, well, we know that there was a letter. And she just penned everything else around it. And I think, wow, okay, that's definitely been creative. And I don't feel necessarily as comfortable in that. And maybe it's because of my subject matter. I work on stuff where you don't want to give deniers any kind of room for manoeuvre. I don't want to have anything where people could question it. But at the same time, I really like the idea that you can, to use your metaphor again, to paint something, do something very vivid and hook the reader. So my start of my new book, I open with this anecdote about how news of Hitler's death was broadcast on the radio. And there's a couple of paragraphs where I've talked about the 1st of May, 1945 being unseasonably cold in the city of Hamburg. I talk about this radio station that is a bit of an anomaly because it's survived bombing campaigns. I described the architecture, even mentioned the fact that it's got a 2-meter dial of a clock face on the outside. And I talk about the programming that they'll be doing all day. It was all building up to say, and then at about 10:25, you get the drum rolls and they announce Hitler's death. And I had quite a lot of fun doing that. And that's not sort of my usual style. I hadn't used anything like that before. But I thought, I'd really want to get people in the moment. But every single facet of that, I was paranoid about backing it up with some kind of historical evidence. Yes, I checked the weather forecast. I've checked the music schedule. I've looked at historic photographs of this radio building. So everything there is rooted in something that I can prove. And I think it's the thing of, I guess, not being too imaginative in the leaps that I'm taking, but as you say, kind of being creative in how I pull it together and package it.
And that, for me, was the beauty of reading that opening, because I realise it isn't actually a conversation we've had, but the assumption that I made reading that opening was exactly that Caroline has gone and checked the weather and this and that and the other, because the thing that obviously as a Jewish person in London right now I'm dealing with a lot is there is a sense of it can't be that bad or this can't happen. And that when things are so bad, one of the ways the human brain protects itself is to go, that's just imagination or that's exaggeration. And that what if, that ability to empathise that creative writers have as bread and butter is very important for society to be society. So reading something like that where you are bringing in the details, the description, potentially with some people dialogue, all of the creative writing things is important, I would think. Does it make you want to do more of it?
Yes, absolutely, it does. And I'm already starting to think about the next book, and my publisher's very keen to get ideas for the next book. I know what I want to do, but it's a project I've had kicking around in the background even before the Hitler book came on board. And it's having a break away from it, getting totally distracted by writing a whole other book in the meantime. I think it's been useful because I've come back with fresh eyes and realised I was being way too ambitious in everything I wanted to cover before. But also the legacy of the current book is the fact that, it is rich with all these different stories. Hopefully what comes across is the different voices, that this is not a traditional top-down story where you only focus on Hitler and the leadership or the Allied intelligence agencies. You want to really get how real people think and feel and respond to these events. And that's definitely what I want to carry on in my other work. It's like, we might be dealing with some really momentous historical things that have happened, but let's bring it down to grassroots. And so at the moment, I'm just looking for other avenues, more sources that I could use to apply similar sort of techniques in the next project.
It's interesting hearing you say that sort of one book kind of interrupted another book, because I heard one of my favourite fiction authors, Maggie O'Farrell, talking about how one of her novels wasn't the one she thought she was writing, but these characters wouldn't shut up. Here they were, and she needed to do that. And then she was allowed to go and do the next one because they'd had their say. Was it that kind of experience?
A little bit. So before I came to Roehampton, I was at the University of Central Lancashire, and I'd started this project where, this is quite dark, okay. I was looking at the aftermath of Nazi war crimes trials. So what happens to a Nazi war criminal after they're executed? Because as you'll find out if you look at the different trials that happen, whether it's the big Nuremberg one or the zonal trials that Britain and America and France and obviously the Soviets do, they have different attitudes to disposal policy. So they might be buried in prison grounds away from public view. They might be cremated so nobody can trace them. Again, the idea, you don't want any shrines to these people. You want to stamp out.
Can we just hop in there? Because that was an important thing in your book, was not to have a shrine. Do you want to talk about the imagery? Just to contextualise the lack of pictures of Hitler or Nazism, or because that was an important choice.
It was, and I suppose this is my top tip to anyone: find a publisher who actually gets the point of your book. And because I was a bit nervous about saying, I don't want a picture of Hitler in life in the book or on the cover. So the cover's got this sort of skull kind of picture, which is a propaganda poster from the war. But yes, within it would have been so tempting to.
The cover, for anyone who's not seen it, is a skull with the moustache, and the point is our brains all go Hitler. That I don't want to say cartoon character. I don't know how to describe this.
No, but I think you're onto something there, because it's such a theme of wartime propaganda. You could caricature him by sticking a parting and a moustache on anything, whether it be a snake or anything. In this case, it's a skull, and everybody just kind of makes that connection.
And this was something that was enormously important. I felt extremely sensitively and intelligently handled. Is that you showed exactly what you were talking about without glorifying. You didn't have actual imagery of him or them through the book. You had imagery that was made, like that skull said to our brains Hitler. You have various examples throughout of that, but you didn't give them any more visual airtime.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? Because everybody knows what he looks like, and there's been so much stuff on him. There's still so much stuff on him. I didn't want to replicate that. It felt unnecessary. So let's just keep him as this sort of shadowy presence, I suppose, that runs through the book, but you don't hear from him very much, and you don't see him. I got close. There was one photo I was mulling over where there's a picture of a Nazi funeral, and he was there and he had his back to the camera. But even then I thought, no, that's still too close. And I just went for a completely different angle, so he's not in the shot at all.
And I interrupted you before you said this is why it's important to get the right publisher. What was the conversation with the publisher like over that?
Yeah, they were absolutely fine, because they said, have you got any thoughts on cover design? I said, well, obviously no swastikas. And then ideally, I don't want a picture of Hitler. And every other book on this subject has obviously got a picture of him on. And they were just like, oh yeah, that's fine. And I was like, I was giving myself up to, I might have to push back on this. But they were absolutely fine. And when we were looking at pictures of like broken statues and things like that, rubble from the end of the war, and they were actually very good and said, no, we still think that's just giving him too much dignity. And then eventually we found this image, this French propaganda photo instead, so we went with that. But they've been absolutely brilliant and really kind of got the purpose behind the book. And I suppose there's nothing wrong disclosing the fact that it goes out for peer review, like most academic publications. And they're both lovely, enthusiastic. One of them came back and says, well, it might be worth recapping the central argument at the end of every chapter, in that sort of very academic way, where if you're giving, you want to present your thesis, and my editor was like, no. No. We don't want to disrupt the flow here. This is really good as it is. We want it to, it's something to be read, and you're not just having to.
So interesting hearing you say that, because one of the things I've seen people find difficult to break away from is that almost moralization at the end of a chapter when it's fiction, what they didn't know yet, or just bringing in something that's more narrated, as if we have something in our heads that we're supposed to do this. And it's only now, as I hear you say that I realise that is a leftover from academia.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? And I think there's nothing wrong with letting the reader just kind of draw their own conclusion. I'm obviously they're being guided in a certain way through it, but I don't necessarily want to hit them over the head all the time saying this is what you should be thinking, Yeah. I often get quite fed up with people just like quite tediously repeating the same thing over again.
Yeah.
It's just like, no, come on.
Because it's another example of show don't tell, isn't it? You're doing that.
Yeah, exactly.
You don't want to force feed.
Yeah. And I suppose if the writing's good enough, it should be able to stand up for itself, isn't it?
Staying with the relationship with it was your editor who said that, wasn't it? Oh no,
Yes.
we don't need that. So staying with your relationship with your editor, what else in your experience makes a good editorial relationship?
I mean, I just think I've had a very positive, warm experience. It hasn't been as hands-on as I thought it might have been. And I think maybe that, again, that's quite a testament to how confident they felt with the original proposal and the original manuscript. I mean, one of the early meetings, I think they suggested, we'll come back with loads and loads of comments. And in the end, they weren't, because they seemed to just think, oh, yeah, actually, this is fine. And they just made me a couple of minor cosmetic things come up in copy editing. But they just really had faith in it. And it was a nice, trusting relationship, I suppose. They're not breathing down my neck. They're confident that I was going to get it delivered in time. They like the result. And they've been brilliant at coming up with ideas as to how to talk about it to different audiences. And my editor wrote the blurb that's on the publishing website, and it's obviously replicated across various booksellers now. So there's a bit where it talks about Adolf Hitler was taking a long time to die. That's his work, his bit. But he sent it to me approval, and I was like, yeah, actually that totally nails it. So it's having that trusting relationship. I think
it's a mirror in a way, isn't it, of what is landing, so that you can, oh yes, now I'm there.
And then just before the book came out publicly, they invited me to their offices. This would have been the end of January. And we had a little lunchtime kind of mini talk for me, sort of like 10 minutes, kind of again summing up the themes of the book with all the rest of the staff, so they could go away feeling, okay, this is the sort of thing that we can say if we're going to be marketing it or putting it on social media, anything like that. And it was just really nice, actually, to get the support from the whole team as well.
That's lovely. What sort of examples were there? What's that like for people who haven't sat in a room like that? What happens?
Well, I'd never done it before. And they just said, well, if you come in and you just want to talk for about 10 minutes. And my editor sort of introduced me, and he sort of picked out some of the reviewers' comments early on. And then I sort of just tried to sum it up and say, well, obviously there's a lot of things written on Hitler. These are what I think are my USPs. And I had some slides so I could show them some key illustrations and stuff. But it was a useful exercise, a 10-minute elevator pitch essentially as to what's so unique and exciting about this. And then it's been great practice for then doing subsequent media interviews and podcasts, trying to hit those points. And then it just ended up like a nice informal, friendly conversation. Someone had questions, how did you come to that image? Something else, Yeah, it's just really supportive.
And either editorially or in marketing or anything else, have there been times you've needed to push back on something?
So there's one thing. So we've negotiated the audio rights and with Audible, and they came back with a list of actors that I could have a listen to their work and see which one I would like to pick. They're all American actors, and the first couple seemed very sort of a bit more enthusiastic than perhaps I was going for. I think I'm naturally more, a calmer kind of thing. And so I didn't want anything that might end up sounding too dramatic. But also they were all men. And that was the one time I've really pushed back and said, well, this is the first book on this topic by a female historian. It would be quite nice to have a female voice to represent that. And that's what we have managed to do. We found a female actor to do it.
That is such a wonderful example, and I do think it's worth staying with when something good happens, when you get the publisher you want, when you're in the meetings you want to be in. It's very important not to go into good girl, good boy brain space. This is your thing, and that is such an important topic that at every stage you have not glorified this. You have said, this is important. We need to know about this subject because that's how we don't repeat these things. We need to learn. And having those assumptions called out, I think, is so powerful, that they went for something dramatic so that it can be, and actually, no, it doesn't need that kind of glorification. And it doesn't need to be male.
Yeah, exactly. You don't need the whole Hollywood voiceover style. And I suppose there was the other thing I pushed back on is when I embarked on doing some podcasts and interviews to promote the book, which again was totally uncharted territory for me. Nobody normally cares what I'm writing about. And there was a couple of early ones where they were brilliant at giving me questions in advance, so I kind of knew roughly how to steer things. And there was one which came back, and it had questions pertaining to Hitler's physical, mental health, and certain alleged abnormalities on his physique. And I was like, no, I do not want to get into this, because I don't understand. Apart from the fact that I just think it's a bit creepy to be pondering Hitler's genitals all this time.
For anyone who doesn't know, which I think is unlikely, there's a whole thing about how many balls, and there's other things too.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like,
and we don't think he needs any more attention.
It's too sensationalist, and I'm not quite sure what the point is. You're just trying to find out that there's something physically abnormal there, and that will explain everything that he did. That's too far too simplistic, and I don't want to do anything that is just gonna treat him as this complete aberrant curiosity, because that's also dangerous, isn't it? You were saying earlier about the conditions in which atrocities, things like this can happen. Yeah. You've got to recognise the ordinariness of some of these perpetrators. So just keep trying to other them for whatever quirk or reason is limiting, isn't it?
It is. I do feel I need to talk about how important it is that we read about what happened, because the whole point of Never Again, the whole possibility of Never Again, is to acknowledge and understand that it did happen in the first place. And I guess I'd just like to ask what it's like for you writing about that, or what you hope people will understand from your writing.
Yes, I think writing and teaching, it is trying to get people thinking, I suppose, about the conditions in which a Hitler-type character is possible. The Holocaust doesn't just happen overnight. You've got all this gradual erosion of moral boundaries, sectors of society that go along with things or help implement things. You've got to think, 1930s Germany, it's a civilized, cultured, well-educated nation. Most of these perpetrators, are respectable people, and to this point, so what is it that gets people to push those boundaries, to do other things? And so just thinking like that, I think is so important. And phrases like Never Again, I often sigh when I hear that, to be honest. I teach a module, my third year students, on the Holocaust. And one of the things at the start, they always come out with those platitudes. We study it so we don't repeat it. And it's like, well, how's this working out?
Because right now we're seeing that slow erosion of what it's okay to say and what it's okay to scapegoat.
Yeah, exactly. And people articulating anti-Semitism, people perpetrating violence. I won't get on my soapbox about refugees and migration, but there's all these issues, isn't it?
You can get on your soapbox.
We're not learning from the past, are we? If these things continue to happen. And one of the things that my students are thinking about on my module is, this whole lessons rhetoric, but then also things like the effectiveness of education or memorialisation. We might have Holocaust Memorial Day, and we might have, schools around the country maybe doing special assemblies on that day. But what about the other days of the year?
Can I ask you about writing habits, routines, stuff that works for you? Given that you are teaching, living a life, doing all of the things, how do you make it work for you?
It is hard. I have gone to so many advice sessions where people say, make time for research, write so many words a day, or have a day where you sit down and you write for 20 minutes and whatever, and you have these routines, and you always think, yes, but it never really works in practice. And I think I've decided that, partly because of the intrusion of, as you say, the rest of my life, having a shared office space at work is not conducive to really focusing on writing. It's good for, quick email writing and things like that, but not for my stuff. Knowing you've got to sort of juggle admin tasks and marking and teaching prep and blah, 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 and it all bleeds into each other if you're not careful. So I've often, so that's one why I struggle to have a very, very strict routine. And then I also thought that actually just trying to hit targets per day actually kind of makes it a bit harder in a way. It makes it more work, if that makes sense. Oh, I'm doing this, I have to do this sort of thing. And it's like sometimes you hear people talking about, oh, we'll do this and, hold yourself accountable. And again, it feels like it's a bit of a burden.
It's so funny. I love finding out examples of words that either really work for people, really don't work for people. I love accountable because I feel like there's somebody else there, but you don't love accountable, possibly because your job involves actual management to who you are. I don't know.
Well, play around with synonyms. I'm not sure. When I was writing the Hitler book, one of my old university friends, who's at another university, he was writing his latest book. And so we weren't holding ourselves to deadlines. We weren't necessarily getting on live calls and stuff and doing it in tandem. But every now and then we'd be sending each other our chapters. So it was kind of a soft kind of support, both in the same boat, both writing similar length pieces. And that was really, really good. And that's a nice, gentle encouragement, thinking, oh, he sent me his piece, I should really send him something in return.
And just knowing someone else is there as well. Like in the Writers' Gym, we have a group that is called 24-Hour Writing Room. So although we see each other online when we want to pretty much every day, there's a space for that. If somebody is doing it at a time when other people aren't there, they say they're doing it, people can emoji back, and it just means that there's other people in the universe at a distance.
Yeah, I do think that is good, because it can be so isolating, and just sometimes you just want to talk to somebody about, I've been trying to nail this tricky paragraph all morning, and you just want to vent about it or get another pair of eyes on it. Can be really useful. I've tried different techniques. Partly there used to be 3 of us at another university, and then we all went our separate ways. So at one point we had what we called writing retreats, which was basically a glorified weekend at one of our houses. And we would have grand plans, which we'd announce the first night over wine, of course. But it was a nice way of juggling, catching up, having an excuse to come together. And then we would, have sort of half an hour or so, we'll do a bit, we'll come back, have coffee, how's it going, do a bit more. And that was really nice. So we did that in some early stages.
Did you find that was a more productive way of doing things than the bursts during the working week?
I think it was. The danger is we'd get so sidetracked into catching up that, we may not be as productive as we could. But I suppose if you're setting aside a special weekend, it feels like you're going to get something more out of it. And it links to something I heard Roehampton did. So we had this a consultant coming in with a session called Making Time for Research. It was all the usual stuff about, saying no, not, be confident enough to say no to unnecessary tasks. We supposedly have research allocation in our workload that we should really be trying to ring fence and say, right, this is my research day, I'm only going to do research. And he said, yeah, I know all of this. But what he came up with was really helpful. Is that if you imagine you're looking forward to a particular event, or you've got a day off and you're thinking, right, okay, I'm going to go for a run in the morning, I'm going to nip to the shops, I might go and buy that new novel that I really want, I might go and meet somebody for coffee. And once you start planning it with all those sort of things, then it's harder to kind of backtrack on those tasks and let something else get in the way.
They exist now.
They exist, exactly. And so it's rather than just saying, this is my research day or this is my writing time, let's have a plan, if you like, or a sense of, right, okay, I'm going to sit down. First of all, I'm going to write my thoughts on that particular source that I thought was really super interesting. And then I might go and revisit this. And once it becomes tangible, again, it becomes something you can protect more. And I think that was the most useful tip I had. It's not just say, I'm going to have writing, but actually I've got a very specific thing that I'm going to do.
It's so true, isn't it? Because an empty day can just feel like tumbleweed. You can think it's going to be wonderful, and then you arrive and then, oh my God, it's overwhelming. But if there's this many things, and maybe I'll change the order during the day, but fundamentally I'm doing these things.
Sometimes, I mean, like a lot of people, you have the tyranny of the blank page, don't you? And it's just like trying to get started. And I guess I do a lot of my writing or my jotting down ideas on the computer. But sometimes it just doesn't work. And I've tried different things. I might say, okay, well, let me just break it down to bullet points. What are some of the essential things I want in this bit? And then I might go back and like, can I flesh this point out? And it starts to grow. But the other thing is I often do just go back, pen and paper. It can be a nice notebook, although I'm often too scared to write in a really nice notebook because, I haven't got anything worthy enough to go on those beautiful pages. But, scraps of paper, whatever, And then it's something, I guess it's about getting back in touch with the actual physical materials of writing. And suddenly something will just burst. And whether it's just mind mapping links between sources, whether again it's sketching out a plan or a point of argument, somehow it just works better than just sitting in front of this cold screen, staring at it and thinking, why isn't this going?
There's a couple of things in there that are so important about how the blank page becomes not the blank page. You do your bullet points, you leave notes for future you, in my language. So it's not about a beautiful sentence. It's not about moving from the beginning to the end beautifully. It's about plonking it down there and then coming back to it and coming back to it. And that is so important. But another thing that also is very important, I think, in there is that beautiful notebook issue. That the way that I now look at it is it's like a friendship. The way that I invest in friendship is by being vulnerable with that person. It's by showing up. It's by spending the time with them. And that's what I say to myself now with my notebooks is this is my friend, and you don't get the friendship you want unless you're prepared to be there and create it. So here I am, Hineni, in the notebook.
That's a really good way to finish. I might go and scribble in some now.
Things I love. This is not an advert for them, although they are friends of mine. But there's a reason. Flame Tree, those notebooks with the magnet edges, and you know, I still have the feeling on the first page of any of those. Isn't it beautiful? And then I remember, oh yes, this happened last time. Mm-hmm. We know what that means. It means we care about the writing, but we also know it means that vulnerability is the way in. So here I am. I'm curious about the recent Big Issue and Telegraph pieces. How did you create that? Did you contact them? What happened there?
That is all down to my amazing publicist at Yale, Catherine Powell. Kat has been absolutely phenomenal in getting these opportunities out there. So big shout out to Kat. She's amazing. But again, kind of pushing me out of my comfort zone. You know, my rule at the moment is I'm saying yes to everything, essentially. I might be very cynical, but I'm thinking there'll never be anything as big as this again, because sadly Hitler seems to sail. So I'm just kind of going to ride this adventure wherever it takes me at the moment. But it's been all sorts of opportunities. Different podcasts is one thing, but actually having the opportunity to write for people, because in my naivety of thinking, oh, you know, they'll come back and they want to interview me. It's like, no, we want to commission a piece. It's like, oh, okay. And the Daily Telegraph had a very particular theme in mind, which I did, and they had a word count. And then, of course, they made them the most incredibly clickbaity headline, which has got nothing to do with the content. Which
it's infuriating, isn't it?
That was super infuriating. I was slightly mollified when I actually got to see it in print there, because it was something like, because my dad's always bought this, which probably says something about his politics. But it actually having something physical to look at was felt really nice. The Big Issue was just like so many words, whatever. So I just tried to give a big overview. But that was about 800 words. So it felt a bit more like a blog style piece. The Aspects of History magazine, for them, they said, can you write something? And I said, well, having looked at them, thinking that they write about different types of history, obviously, the title. So it's, well, you know, this is very much a cultural history thing. Maybe I can use this to talk about why I think the cultural history lens is so important, so valuable. And I like that idea. And that was a really nice exercise, actually, to just kind of reflect back on the fundamental approach and pen it that way. But all the time I'm thinking, well, again, we said earlier about students writing long sentences, and it's still kind of like the urge, isn't it, in academia to be quite waffly. And I was like, right, okay, I've only got a few words. It's for a magazine. It's got to be accessible. It's got to be a bit poppy in the writing, which is actually quite a liberating experience in the end. And I did have a lot of fun with that piece. And most recently, I was invited to do the page 99 test. Have you done that? So the idea is this famous quote, isn't it, that if you look on, I can't remember the word for word, but if you go to page 99 in any book, you're supposed to be able to deduce that its core, its essence. And there's this site hosted by a guy in the States, which basically challenges writers to apply the test. He says sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And so I thought, this could be interesting. My first thought was, page 99, it's probably going to be an image or a map or something. But it drops you down in the middle of middle of the news breaking of Hitler's death. So it's early May 1945. And I thought, so in a way it does sort of work, because the book is about, you know, how his story emerges. But ultimately, it was a snapshot of from my point of view, exactly the wrong bit, because it was 1945 that everybody associates with it. And I'm talking about this much longer term history of how his death has been imagined or reimagined over the years. But so I was able to sort of say, yes, okay, these things it works, and this bit it doesn't. And you're actually, by just dipping in on one page, you're missing the overall framework. But that I thought was a really useful exercise to actually revisit your writing. And obviously, I don't know what's going to end up on page 99. That's down to the typesetter, isn't it? That's not me. But it was really useful to actually think, well, actually, what is going on this page? Is everything on it important?
Yeah. And as long as people understand that writing and editing are the different things they are, it is a really positive exercise, because the getting it out of your head and onto the page, the being vulnerable with the page happens, and then you improve it, and then you bring it closer and you narrow the gap between what was in your head and and what's on the page where you want it to be. And that's when the numerical magic maybe comes in, that, you know, for all of it not being what you wanted to focus on, it's still, as you acknowledged, a key area and a key aspect, and that was page 99. So it's really, really interesting that happened.
Yeah. It may not have done. I think we've moved the list of illustrations in the book to the end, but that was purely so we could fit another image on a particular point in a page without the whole flow being disrupted.
What can you tell us about what might be coming next?
Right, okay, so I started to give you some hints earlier. I have always been interested in perpetrator commemoration. I have this longer term project which is exploring the post-execution history of Nazi war criminals, and very particularly, you know, people who were involved in the Holocaust in one way or another, whether they're concentration camp guards, whether they're desk bureaucrats, etc. Often their trial and execution is taken as this nice, neat endpoint to their story. But actually what happens to them after their execution does vary depending on who was doing the trial in the first place. So the wartime allies end up with very different methods for disposing of their bodies. Some cremate them so they can't be seen. Some offer relatives the chance to reclaim the bodies as long as they have a quiet family burial. The thing is, though, whichever method they choose, it all kind of comes back to the fore in the 1950s when West Germany regained sovereignty. Some graves that have been prison grounds are exhumed, remains transferred to an ordinary civic cemetery, for instance. And throughout the post-war years, there have been incidences of cemeteries holding Nazi remains becoming focal points for Waffen-SS reunions or neo-Nazi demonstrations. And yeah, you have to look at the case of Rudolf Hess. After his death in 1987, his burial spot becomes an annual pilgrimage kind of site for sympathisers. So he's exhumed in 2011. And so that was my relatively recent example, which made me think, oh, actually, they are still causing all these problems with the living. But what I'm doing with this book is sort of a case study of different policy initiatives, and I'm thinking about the handling of that difficult corpse, teasing out the emotions involved as well. There's some big ethical questions anyway about, can you deny anyone their last wishes regardless of who they were in life? That has been thrown out, the topic before, when people have struggled to, you know, get the burial that they wanted. But also just thinking about the campaigning that goes on and the letters, there's correspondence between condemned men and their wives or their mothers or something. And so what I'm really trying to do is trying to pick up more of those sort of petitions and weave those into the story and create this much more human interest story. But essentially it's that reminder again, isn't it, that these can often be seen as very ordinary figures. And it's the fact that they might have relatives who actually might want to mourn them is unsettling, but also important to think about for those reasons, isn't it?
And it's important, as with everything we've been talking about, that we understand the nuances and that we understand the risks and the dangers, that we don't go never again like it's something we can tick off. It's about what we understand and what happens next every day.
Yeah, that's the next big project to try and write up.
Well, thank you for doing this so appropriately, sensitively, intelligently. It was a real pleasure to be at the launch of that and to read that. And looking forward to the next one. Caroline Sharples, thank you so much for joining the Writers' Gym.
Thank you so much for having me.
You've visited the Writers' Gym with author and coach Dr Rachel Knightley. Production and sound design are by Ashley Lexine, and theme music is by Chris Gregory.